Please join me in welcoming Steve Blank.
So, thank you very much for having me here today. It's great to be in Washington because it's the only place where technology innovation is just one press release away. So, and I actually didn't believe that till I heard this morning we invented $2.50 a gallon gas, so most of you could go home. The title of the talk today is The Scientific Method for Getting Technology to Market. And I think that was to get you in the room, because I wouldn't call it that at all. There's nothing scientific about it. I'd rather call this talk How to Fail Less. And for those of you who've actually been trying to commercialize your technology, you know exactly what I mean. Just as an aside, this talk, while it might seem like it's for just startups and early stage ventures, actually is for both startups and large corporations, and at the end of the talk I'll be giving you examples of both. I'm going to compress about 8 weeks of learning into the next 45 minutes. So if the slides look like a blur, it's on purpose, because the idea is to give you the gestalt, the sum of what I'm trying to say, and we'll post the slides online if anybody actually thought it was useful at the end. So I read a blog called steveblank.com. Blah, blah, blah. I read a book. It's the one on the right now called The Startup Owner's Manual, which is the next generation of the 4 Steps to the Epiphany. This talk is also based on some great work by another writer called Alexander Osterwalder, whose work I'm going to be talking about a lot, called The Business Model Canvas. So the first half of the talk is going to be about the ABCs of innovation, just kind of the basics, the theory of what I'm trying to tell you. But the second half is the practice. How does this really work in the real world? The big idea for today is that startups, and by startups I mean early stage ventures or innovation startups in large corporations, are not smaller versions of large companies. We spent 50 years in Silicon Valley simply getting this wrong. Large companies execute known business models. But startups are different. Startups are organizations searching for unknown business models. And one of the key reasons startups fail is they confuse search with execution. The things you do in a large corporation, hire more salespeople, build factories, scale engineering, go into production, all make sense when you have a series of knowns. But trying to do that in what is a startup, even though you might give it $500 million, is the beginning of a disaster. And let me give you an example. In a large company, you have repeatable processes. You know who your customers are. You know the product features they like. You know the product market fit that works. You know existing sales channels and pricing. And it's an execution game. You add more. You add more product line extensions. You add more salespeople. You try to get more revenue. And the job specs, what sales does, what marketing does, what engineering does, are all knowns. But in a startup, large company or small, it's completely different. You're searching for a business model. And it's found by the founders, not some process manual that a product management team might have. You're solving for these unknowns, for a match between customer needs and product features. And this is really hard, particularly for technology entrepreneurs or engineers and scientists coming out of a lab. Well, of course I invented this. People are going to love it. Often not. An idea or a technology innovation is just the beginning of a profitable business. And so the question is, what is it we need to search for? We're searching for this thing, again, I call product market fit, and we're searching for a repeatable sales model. Another just thing to observe is that large companies measure their progress and success by accounting. What's accounting? Income statement, balance sheet, and cash flow. I did startups for 20 years, and at my first board meeting, board asked me to put together an income statement, balance sheet, and cash flow. So I found out what that meant, and I taught myself enough accounting, and I added it up, and my income statement in month 1, 0. Pushed it across the table, and the VCs looked at it. It was formatted correctly. The font was nice. The columns added up, and they nodded, and great. Okay, 6 weeks later, another board meeting. Income statement, 0. They nodded. It looked great, etc. This went on for 18 months until I went out of business and ran out of cash, but they were happy because they had some great accounting. It turns out that's the last thing in a startup you want a board of directors asking. The only 2 numbers that's relevant in that entire pile is how much cash do I have left in the bank and how much am I burning every month. What I really want is to be measuring the metrics that actually matter in the search for a business model. What's the average selling price? What's the order size? What's my customer acquisition cost? What's the customer lifetime value? What's my monthly burn rate? Most of these are all unknown on the first day of the startup, whether inside a big company or inside a 3-person company. The other thing that's different between large companies and startups is sales. In the United States, sales is almost a given. Meaning, anybody know the average height of a VP of sales in the U.S.? Anybody know? 6'1", right? And if it's a male, gray hair, and with a great handicap. Because a VP of sales in a large corporation in the United States executes a repeatable process with known titles, known functions, and their goal is to scale more revenue, more profit every year. They're executing a revenue plan. But in a startup, you hire exactly the same people and put them in an early stage venture, and you get the following result. I hired a world-class VP of sales from a Fortune 100 company, actually a Fortune 20 company, in my last startup. Gee, I was excited, and I got them to join, and this is going to be great. And after about our 6th sales call, where we were thrown out on our rear ends in the parking lot, I'm like, my head is spinning. And it's a rainy California winter. We're getting in the car, and I'm like depressed. I'm the founder. And my new shiny VP of sales puts his key in the ignition. And I go, where are we going? And he says, Steve, world-class salespeople, we have incredibly thick skins. We're just going to make some more sales calls. And I said, well, wait a minute. We just got thrown out 6 times in a row. Don't you think we ought to learn anything? And he said, what? I said, learn something. I mean, you know, these people were trying to tell us that we obviously didn't have or weren't saying the right things. He said, no, we're going to make another call. And so as he's driving, I open up my laptop and start changing the PowerPoint. And he goes, what are you doing? I said, well, look, it didn't work. I'm changing the presentation. And the car almost went off the road. You can't do that. I've memorized the sales pitch. Okay, I get back on the road and I'm typing more. What are you doing? I'm changing the pricing model. The car almost went off the other. You can't do that. By the end of the day, I realized that he was a world-class Fortune 20 salesperson, and I fired him. The company wasn't ready for him. In an early-stage venture, you are not executing. The world-class people whose job title says head of sales or head of marketing or head of biz dev in a large corporation who know how to execute normally fail in the first year or 2 of a startup. Not because they're not competent, because the same title actually belies the fact that the job functions are completely different. In an early stage venture, you're looking for early adopters. Pricing and features are unstable. So are the founders, trust me. The business model is not yet repeatable, and you might be doing one-offs to kind of get a feel of where the marketplace is. One of the other key differentiations is that engineering is different, even though they might have the same words. Traditional large corporations in the 20th century did something called waterfall engineering. They spec'd the product, put together a market requirements document, handed it to engineering, wrote up a feature spec, and basically went into waterfall development, developing every feature that product management handed to them. Now, this sounds great if you know what all the features customers need on day one. Yet we now know in early stage ventures, somewhere between 80 and 90% of features when they're shipped are unused and unwanted by customers. That's massive waste of both time and money. So in a startup, we do something very different. We develop the Agile methodology, which is just simply saying we don't know a priori all the possible features customers could want. And so we're going to do iterative and incremental engineering. Waterfall versus Agile. The last piece that's kind of interesting is companies plan. Large corporations are great at plans. In fact, the bigger they are, the bigger the plans. In fact, there's some companies, I don't know how they get up in the morning, there's so much paper, or so many specs. Plans describe knowns. They describe features. They describe everything you've learned. And when you write a business plan in a large company, it's typically predicated on all the things your company is already great at. You know the features, you know customers, you know pricing, you have a revenue forecast. But as we'll see later, using a business plan in a startup is like trying to use a ruler to take temperature. Because what startups need to do are model. They need something that helps them describe unknowns and to figure out customer needs and feature sets as they get out of the building. And I'll tell you this in an example. By the way, the classic large company business plan on how products are introduced kind of goes like this. At least in Silicon Valley, people were drawing this napkin for 50 years. Adopted from large companies. You come up with a concept, you get seed funding, you go into product development, you go to alpha test, beta test, first customer ship. And while you're doing that, you don't realize that you're just executing the leading cause of startup death. Any of this look familiar? Anybody ever draw this on a napkin? Yes. A couple of you are being brave enough to admit it. I did this for 20 years. And in fact, if you would draw this, the VCs would high-five you and go, yeah, that's exactly what we want you to do. What we didn't realize is that for decades, implicit in this diagram were two fundamental flaws. That we understood the customer problem, and therefore we know what features to build. Now, you might be a domain expert, and if you've been in the business for the last 40 years, you might actually understand all the customer problems and all the features to build. But the odds are that's simply not true. But startups were simply executing the business plan. They would hire marketing, they would hire sales, and they would hire biz dev, who I still don't know after 20 years what they exactly do. And then engineering would go into waterfall development. This, if you would have drawn this in any boardroom, Silicon Valley or a large corporation, people would have went, yeah, we want you to do it this way. Yet what we never told each other, never, is that when startups would execute this way, they'd get the first customer ship, they'd have the party, they'd do the launch, and then all of a sudden it would unfold like this. At the first board meeting after first customer ship, everybody's high-fiving each other in the boardroom. Great press, great launch, great party, great food, great whatever, great buzz. Got your photo and online or in the press. Everybody's happy. 6 weeks later, you have another board meeting. Board members turn to the head of sales and go, how are the numbers? Remember, the numbers came from that mythical thing you wrote called the business plan, which, by the way, I now still believe ought to be taught in universities, but in the English department, because it's the best example of creative writing anybody ever does. And so turns to the head of sales, and she says, in response to how are the sales numbers, she goes, great pipeline. Great pipeline. Okay, but the board's heard this before, but they kind of smile, and she smiles, and next board meeting 6 weeks later. How are the numbers? Pipeline, pipeline. And depending on the current economic climate, the board does another tight smile, and they cock their head knowingly about 10 degrees to the CEO. And this goes on for a couple more board meetings. Till one day you open that boardroom door, and I don't know how venture capitalists do this, but there's the stench of death in the room. No one is sitting next to the VP of sales, and somehow they manage to insert a flaming sword over her head, and she has no idea it's there. And the minute she says pipeline, she disappears in a puff of smoke, and a new VP of sales shows up. Now, what's interesting is when I tell the story, every entrepreneur goes, why, of course, that's exactly what happens. When you don't make the plan, you fire an executive. Because the new executive, not being stupid, comes in and says, well, that was a stupid, plan. I'm going to invent something new. But what we've never recognized is how we modified a business plan in an early stage venture was by firing executives, not changing the plan. What I'm going to propose is instead of firing executives, we fire the plan. And I'm going to show you how. Let's change the definition of a startup. And so let me give you theory and then reality. The theory says all I need to do is execute this plan. The reality, after 50 years of doing early stage ventures, is that no business plan survives first contact with customers. None. None. It just doesn't happen. And we now know why it doesn't happen. Because a business plan assumes a whole series of knowns. So let's change the definition. I'm going to now tell you my definition of a startup, large company or small. Number one is startup is a temporary organization. Why is it temporary? Because there's no such thing as a 10-year-old startup. There's a 2-year-old startup attached to an 8-year-old failure. Startups are temporary organizations designed to search. What are they searching for? They're searching for a repeatable and scalable business model. And more importantly, startups need their own tools different from those used in existing companies to build their knowledge of customers and markets and pricing, etc. So let me tell you 3 tools for startups. Startup tool number 1 is agile engineering. Agile engineering is how we build startups, whether they're in large corporations or small. It's the antithesis of waterfall development. It admits that we cannot know all the features customers need on day one. If we can, we ought to be like in a hedge fund somewhere. Because there's no possible way with new technology and new inventions that you could understand all the possible moves that markets, customers, and pricing interact from sitting inside your building. It's an NP-complete problem. So let's build iteratively and incrementally. Startup number 2 is this thing I keep talking about called the business model. Now, for 50 years, academics have loved to throw out the word business model, and there are papers and there's whatever. But I found the best way to explain a business model is this work of this guy I mentioned, Alexander Osterwalder. He says any company, whether it's GE or the smallest startup, can be described in 9 building blocks. And I love this because I make my students now draw their startup business model and fill in all the blocks. And let me explain to you what the blocks are.
An organization's business model can be described with 9 basic building blocks: your customer segment, your value proposition for each segment, the channels to reach customers, customer relationships you establish, the revenue streams you generate, the key resources and key activities you require to create value, the key partners, and the cost structure of the business model. But it's not sufficient to just enumerate the 9 building blocks. What you really want to do is to map them out on a pre-structured canvas. This is what we call the business model canvas, a tool that helps you map, discuss, design, and invent new business models. Let's briefly go through the 9 building blocks, starting with the customer segments. These are all the people or organizations for which you're creating value. This includes simple users and paying customers. For each segment, you have a specific value proposition. These are the bundles of products and services that create value for your customers. The channels describe through which touch points you're interacting with customers and delivering value. The customer relationships outline the type of relationship you're establishing with your customers. The revenue streams make clear how and through which pricing mechanisms your business model is capturing value. Then you need to describe the infrastructure to create, deliver, and capture value. The key resources show which assets are indispensable in your business model. The key activities show which things you really need to be able to perform well. The key partners show who can help you leverage your business model, since you won't own all key resources yourself, nor will you perform all key activities. Then once you understand your business model's infrastructure, you'll also have an idea of its cost structure. So with the business model canvas, you can map out your entire business model in one image. This works for startup entrepreneurs just as well as for the most senior executives.
So one of the interesting things when I put up the business model canvas, particularly when I teach engineers at Stanford or scientists at the NSF, they go, so where's my technology in this? You know, like, yeah, I get all this other stuff. Yeah, I'll hire somebody to do that, but I got this invention. So where does that go? And actually, the invention is what we call the value proposition. It's the core of what your business is, but the key idea is it's not a company. Your invention is just the beginning. So what we have people do is sketch out their business model. That is, each one of those boxes, we make them fill out, what are your hypotheses? Who do you think the customers are? How do you think you're going to make money? How are you going to deliver the product, channel? Do you need any key partners, utilities, etc.? Is there any government regulation? What's your cost structure? Now, what's interesting is, once we have the business model canvas up, we're still inside the building. And we have a great series of hypotheses on how to build our company. But at the end of the day, the real word for hypotheses is guesses. I use the word hypotheses at Stanford because the students pay $50,000 a year. Because they like to say, I'm learning all about hypotheses. But I actually, tell them when they're actually kind of bought into this, actually what you're really doing is guessing. Unless you're a domain expert in every one of these boxes, as smart as you are, whether you've been a professor for 25 years, a researcher for 30, a student for 5, it doesn't matter. You're just guessing. So Steve, why did you tell us about business models if that's all we're doing? We could do that without you. Well, that's the next tool. The next tool is something called customer development. And it's how we search for the repeatable and scalable business model. Customer development starts from a very simple premise. It says there are no facts inside your building, your lab, or your research center. So get the heck outside. Customer development is a 4-step process. First 2 steps are about searching for the model, and the second 2 steps is how do you execute and how do you build it. Search, execution. So for the first step in search is you articulate and test your hypotheses. You write all of them down. You design experiments, and you start by getting out of the building and listening to customers. Not selling anything, not taking a demo, not taking PowerPoint, but testing your assumptions about problem, about price, about everything. This is a continuous discovery process, and it's done by the founders. And by the founders, I mean the scientist, engineer, research lab, who's ever going to be heading this new company, they need to be the ones getting out of the building at first. And this might seem heretical. But I have to tell you, I'll show you some examples of where we could get 45-year-old researchers out there talking to customers. So let me just do a quick example. Let's pick a founding CEO. Boom, you're a founding CEO. Raise your hand. Okay, hire a VP of sales, the guy next to you. All right, go out and ask customers whether they like the product. Go ask them. Go ask them. It stinks. Tell them it stinks. Go ask the woman behind you. It stinks. All right, you're now the VP of sales. You did about a month of this. Go back and tell the CEO. Oh, you're the CEO. It's your idea. What are you going to say? Yeah, you'll fire him later. The first thing is, you're not explaining it correctly. You just don't get it. Go back out again. Now, if we had time, we'd go through this exercise with all of you, but we'd be here for a long time. All right? You go back again, and then you come back and tell them the same thing. Tell them again. Now what do you say? What do you say now? You're fired. Now you're fired. And now you bring another VP of sales and run through this. But I'm going to change the game for all of you. You're not allowed to hire a VP of sales. Get out of the building yourself. Ask the person next to you, what do you think? It stinks. And the person behind you, it stinks even more. Now, if you're a great entrepreneur, After about 2 to 4 times hearing this isn't working, smoke starts coming out of your ears. Because cognitive dissonance is setting in. This is your vision, your passion, and whatever. You got 2 choices. You could ignore the data, or you could try to understand what the objection is. Getting out of the building personally and getting data is essential for any early stage venture. Done by the founders. By the way, I said great entrepreneurs 2 to 4 times hearing this. It took me about 15 to 20. So just for scale. So it took me 8 startups to retire. What you're doing in discovery, you're asking things like, how big is this market? Who's the customer? And by the way, what's their problem or need? Problem or need? I spent years thinking the only purpose of a customer is to write a check for me. What else do they have to do? That's it. Nowadays we know, you could try to push products into customers, and some of them don't really understand their problem or need yet. Because sometimes you're ahead of the market. But boy, it really helps for you to actually understand what problem do they think they have or will they have now or later. It's not just about your technology. What's the product or service that you're building, and does it solve this problem? How do you create demand? How do you deliver it? How do you fund it? How do you make money? And this business model canvas we talked about earlier now becomes the scorecard for all activities getting outside the building. Another key idea in customer development is something called the minimum viable product. It says instead of building the entire product, putting a whole staff of engineers on it and finishing every possible feature, we're not going to do that. We're in fact going to run experiments with the minimum feature set, trying to get customer feedback and orders, if possible, as early as possible. And the scary thing we learned time and again is we were building the wrong thing. Not 100% the wrong thing, but 80% the wrong thing. And that other 20%, if we just would have heard it up front, could have saved us enormous time, expense, and energy. So we designed this process as you come up with business model hypotheses, you design experiments to quickly test, you gather data, and more importantly, you gather insight, modifies the hypotheses. The next step is customer validation. This is where you finally do begin to sell. But now you're selling to people we call early evangelists. Because the people who tend to buy early are the ones who will put up with buggy, unfinished, incomplete hardware or software that breaks often. Not that any of you will make any of that. But it happens all the time. And the mistake entrepreneurs make is thinking that on day one, they're ready to sell to mainstream markets. Might happen, but more often what you're looking for are the equivalent visionaries to you inside large organizations or government agencies, etc., who share your passion and are willing to take a risk on an early, unfinished product because it gives them either competitive advantage, financial advantage, political advantage, etc. That means 19 out of 20 people you're talking to are just not ready for you. Doesn't mean never. It just means it's okay to get a lot of no's up front for an early stage product. And there's this idea of a pivot, which says instead of firing people, if we're wrong about our hypotheses, we change our business model. And the pivot is the heart of customer development. It's this iteration without crisis. It says it's okay that we got one or more of the business model canvas hypotheses wrong. A pivot says, great, we thought the customer segments were utilities. Gee, the customer segments are really large corporations. Or the pricing model should be, direct sale and asset sale. Oh no, actually, they're more interested in the lease model. None of that could be found inside the building. All of those are expensive mistakes to make after you've scaled, hiring 50 salespeople, or gone into production. It allows us to be fast, agile, and opportunistic. So instead of firing founders when they don't make the plan, first thing you do is fire the plan. The last thing that differentiates startups is the cycle time of pivots. That is, how agile and rapid you do this. And how quickly you're out testing your hypotheses is what minimizes cash needs, minimizes the amount of things you're building on day one, and gives you near instantaneous customer feedback. So I told you there'd be a bunch of theory. This is it for the theory. Now, this would just be, a nice academic lecture if we hadn't already done this. And we've done this from anything from startups to a Fortune 10 company. And I thought rather than me talking about it, let me show you an example of a startup, one who was working in the graphene business. As I said, or as Elon said, I teach this at Stanford, at Berkeley, at Columbia, for the National Science Foundation, and we're going to be talking about an example at GE as well. Any GE people here? Yeah, come on, raise your hand. Yeah. They've done great with this. So from startups to large companies. National Science Foundation, we'll be talking about earlier or later. We teach this in a class, 8 weeks, from an idea to a business. 8 weeks. Here's an example of one.
A brief introduction.
Let me turn up the sound, please.
Introduction by Graphene Frontiers. Our intrepid entrepreneurial lead, Jen Tong, Tom.
This is a movie they made about themselves, so excuse the
copper foil
resolution.
is placed into a CVD furnace, and graphene is grown on the surface of the copper using a process that we submitted for patent protection. Once the film is grown, the graphene can be transferred to essentially any substrate to serve as a transparent conductive film. Graphene on thin plastic can be bent into different shapes as desired with no change in the graphene properties. Graphene on solid glass substrates is highly transparent with minimal haze. Our goal is to develop these two systems as components of high-quality, next-generation displays. Here you see 3M's vision of the future of display technology. Transparent conductors based on graphene could enable such displays to be realized. We believe that Graphene Frontiers can be a leader in the development of large-area graphene for these applications and others.
So they came into class thinking, hey, thanks for letting us in this NSF program, but, this is easy. All we're going to do is execute our plan, and thanks, and, not much here to learn. Let me just tell you, at the end of these 8 weeks, they spoke to 48 companies, had 70-plus conversations. And here was the team. Principal investigator was Charlie Johnson, kind of a leader in graphene electronics and nanotubes. But basically, they came in and said, Steve, I don't know why we're here, but thanks for the money. We love the program, but we're just going to go execute. Graphene is the wonder material. It's, Nobel Prize. So we need to scale up production. That's all we're here for, is to learn how to do that. So we're just going to take the class and go do that. Well, that's great. They had a scalable production process that operated at ambient pressure, and they thought all they needed to do is scale this up. And they said, look at the market size. Everybody know how to draw market size diagrams, right? Starts small, gets very big, right? And, every VC kind of practiced rolling their eyes, and, that's what the conversation usually is about. And they came in with the exact same thing. See, it's small, and then it's going to be big, and look at that, and okay. So these, by the way, are their slides, not ours. It said graphene technology will change the world, but the only thing that's stopping it is availability in commercial volumes. Our technology allows us to do that, and we're the right team and the right technology. Now, if this was a venture pitch, the next slide would have said, and we're raising $20 million. But instead, we made them write down their hypotheses. And so their hypotheses were graphene could be used for anything. And the market will explode in 2012, and they're going to become the world's largest graphene manufacturer. And so they came into class with a business model canvas, not a blank one, but they actually did the work, and they filled it out. They said, our value proposition, the thing in the center is the material and the process. And look at all those customer segments. Look at all of them. I mean, we could sell to everybody. And our revenue streams, we have 8 revenue streams. I mean, we're going to just be our biggest problem with this startup, our biggest problem, truly, implicitly, when they were saying this, was where will we have enough room to put the bags of money? I mean, that was, I'm looking at this Nobel Prize, okay, bags of money, So here's what they did. They, did some great research to identify target companies. They built a list, and they basically asked some great questions. Who else should we talk to? And do you know anyone? So they started networking. They even ran a Google AdWords campaign. And which actually got them a ton of leads, but not too many great contacts. But they were at a conference, at an alumni event, and someone said, hey, this is terrific. I work at DuPont. Here's my card. Turned out it was the chief innovation officer at DuPont. So they engaged in 48 companies, 70 conversations. I kind of grayed out who they really talked to, but if you squint quickly, you can write them all down. They did a bunch of blog posts. We make our students blog their customer discovery narrative. As they're out of the building, every interaction they have ends up on a shared WordPress blog that we could all look at and give them feedback in real time. So they did version 2. They said, yeah, you know, we had too many customer segments, and some of the ones we talked to when we actually said, would you buy anything, kind of went away. So we've narrowed this down to thermal management solutions, transparent conductors for touchscreens, and chem biosensors. And by the way, our 8 revenue streams, we're either going to do license and royalty or maybe some material sales. So what they learned is their production process really is a key value add. And they really do need to figure out on how to scale. But they quickly realized that manufacturing wasn't their business. They really didn't want to be in the manufacturing business. They decided that what they really wanted to be is a licensing and royalty organization. Key insight. No way they would have understood this without those 70 conversations. So now they started to figure out what products should they be making first, second, and third. And they found out that the transparent screens are viable. The TEM grids are viable, but they're near-term, small market. But displays will be the next big thing. And so what they really needed to do is figure out a business strategy that got them from the transmission electron microscopes grids into the screen business. So the first thing they did was take a look at the transparent screen business, and they said, you know what? We could probably make money with an intermediate product. And they investigated membrane switches and material sales, and they said, nah, that isn't going to work either. And what they finally did is a major pivot. They said, we get it. We have 2 business models. One is, what's our short-term model, and what's our mid-term model? So our near-term business is selling graphene grids to electron microscopists. I can't say that word, so you're going to have to guess. The people use electron microscopes. And they were going to do revenue sharing with distributors. But their midterm business is flexible, transparent conductors for screens. And they realized that cost, the lowest possible cost, wasn't even an issue. If they could deliver what they said, all of a sudden, people said, we'd pay anything for the early introduction, be the first. And so they now pivoted again, and they finally figured out that their strategy looks like this. First half of 2012, 4-inch scale-up. They're going to make grids for electron microscopes, and then they're going to scale up the sheet size. Later on this year, they're going to do rotor-roll design and prototypes. They're going to license the process. And then in 2013 forward, they're going to make thin-film flexible displays. So what they needed to do is get distribution partners, continue active customer conversations, and get manufacturing partners. Now, the reason I show this is this was a university professor with his graduate student. He got out and had 70 conversations in 8 weeks. He swore when he came in, he absolutely understood how to build this business. Quite different when he left.
Hello
Let me
everyone.
give you another one.
Welcome to ARPA Solutions presentation video.
This was somebody who was building an
year,
LED lighting
we have learned a lot
solution.
about the technology, the entrepreneurial process, how to work with a team of engineers, and how to lead a team of undergraduate co-ops to prototyping success. Our business plan pivoted twice. We pivoted from a model that manufactured an enhanced, highly efficient LED lamp to manufacturing a heat pipe module that any manufacturer of LED lamps would be proud to use.
They thought they
We
were
did
building
pivot
the
away from
lights,
this
they ended up in the heat
having
pipe
met in the
business.
course of this program a number of companies who wanted to partner with us to explore the use of this technology in different applications. Our business model now has to bring to the table our expertise in the heat pipe industry and our IP. Initially, it seemed so unlikely that we would pivot or change this model at all. It still is a great opportunity manufacturing that LED lamp, but these pivots, they happen so organically that partway through a meeting we would realize that we were working towards another product. We look at each other and say, well, oh, that makes perfect sense. How come we didn't see that before? Prototyping that heat pipe to create industry-specific form factors has been very hard. The learning curve there has been steep. Understanding that customers want your technology, but they're not lined up to buy it if it's perceived as too expensive, or that they're very patient waiting for that price to fall, or even that there are other ways to market
really
than what you
interesting
thought
people.
initially. It's all been eye-opening. It's been a great experience. We're more attuned to the market now, and we're starting further along the depth.
So these guys spoke to 97 customers in 8 weeks. Major change from we're making LED lights standing in line with everybody else to we're being an OEM supplier to LED manufacturers. By the way, these two examples were two of the 21 teams in 2011 that the National Science Foundation Innovation Corps put together. By the end of 2012, they're going to be running at a rate of 200 teams a year. They're putting together a national university network of educators to teach this process called the Lean Launchpad. First it was taught at Stanford. In July it's going to be taught at University of Michigan and Georgia Tech as well. And other universities are going to be added to this list. As you know, the NSF funds basic research all the way on the left. That was their, and still is, their main charter. But the Innovation Corps fits in to what they call the ditch of death. Kind of that area between university and small business. And in the meantime, a good number of you who are capital constrained have encountered the valley of death when you need hundreds of millions of dollars. But the I-Corps was to fund that small transition point from a SBIR phase 1 to phase 2 and 3. So these are two examples from small 4 or 5 person startups. But some of you are probably sitting there going, well, I work in a large corporation. This can't possibly work in a large company. Let me tell you how it worked for GE in their energy storage division. And it's the only, or one of the few corporate customers we've been working with, done it for the last 3 years. It's their Durathon battery systems division. As you know, they have about a 50-year history with battery business, including now their sodium metal halide batteries from 2006 on. They had a charter from the CEO that said, we want this to be $1 billion business. And the first step for the division general manager, Prescott Logan, was, as chartered by the CEO of GE, build a factory. In fact, not only build a factory to scale. I want you to spend $100 million building this factory. We bought this technology. It's obviously ready to go. We have a great consulting report from a brand name consultant. See those diagrams and those Venn diagrams? Small circle, big circle. Okay, go build the factory. And the GM bet his job. He said, no, we're not going to do that. He said, let's get customers first. And so what they did was take this battery, which are built in cells, modules, and complete systems that could provide hours, if not days, of backup. And he asked 3 questions. One is, will the technology work? It looks like it's going to scale. But are there any customer commitments, and can we make it in volume? And this is where this customer development process came in on GE. And so they did a classic segment analysis, which are the right size and what's the right growth, and let's go invest obviously in the ones with the largest attractiveness and our biggest ability to compete. But they used this discovery and validation process to first take a look and prioritize opportunities. EV, rail, mining, signal, security, etc. But they decided that they really needed to do was to get out of the building, to generate these hypotheses and get out. And in the last 2 years, the top 5 executives have probably flown 1 million miles each. I mean, truly, in every major continent, asking customers what their needs were and trying to understand them. And then they took the data and they started executing on it. So they had discussions with 50 different customers in the first year, clustered into 15 different segments. So customer discovery, customer validation, hopefully customer creation, and then building the plant and their division. They used the business model canvas. This is theirs. Basically what the value proposition was, what the customer segment, red, yellow, green. Because GE is so great at the Six Sigma process, everything had to have a set of metrics that goes with it, and they do a great job at that. So they modified the canvas according to do we have high, medium, or low confidence in each one of those hypotheses. They found out as they started talking is that the partners, supposedly who were partners, were just order takers. That they really didn't have partners, because the partners for something this new, they weren't stupid. They said, hey, listen, when you get orders, tell us and we'll fulfill them for you. And so their channel partners expected their division to deliver customers. So this new division actually realized that they needed to figure out who the new end users were. And when they did, they finally discovered that it varied notably by channel, by user, and geography. And so they, did the obvious. They got out and started talking to a ton of segments, and they found out that not all customers are alike, even in identical verticals. That there was real customer segmentation. And they also found that they really needed to focus on a segment strategy, because how they described their battery and their solution really depended on segments. One of them happened to be energy storage and the grid, but my favorite story was the one about cold storage. They happened to visit a warehouse, cold storage warehouse, where they kept refrigerated meats and goods, etc., trying to understand whether there might be a business in forklifts, in replacing batteries in forklifts. And this plant they happened to visit was cold. And they noticed as they were hanging out is that those forklifts kept going back to get their batteries recharged. And they went, boy, what kind of crummy batteries do you use? They're like, you're recharging them about 3 or 4 times more than we've ever seen you. One said, in the cold, these things don't do too well. And they went, really? Well, how bad are they? And they gave them some of the numbers, and they said, wow, we have high temperature batteries. These things work from, minus 40 degrees centigrade all the way to plus 65. I mean, we don't have a cold problem. And all of a sudden, standing there, they realized that they had discovered a niche that there was no way they would ever known sitting inside the building. Another good GE story happens to be that they were talking to an architect in Philadelphia who was trying to provide UPS backup for a large high-rise. And all of a sudden, when they were describing the small footprint, somewhere between a third or a fifth of traditional batteries, the architect said, I don't care what it costs. If I could save space in this building, space is the premium. And so getting out of the building helped them understand what customers needed and how to modify their products. So I hope I gave you a couple of examples of why customer development is much more than just, I have a great technology idea, that you truly could be masters of your own fate. But let me give you an example of what I thought, just to close, of an interesting technology entrepreneur story. At the beginning of the 20th century, there was a guy who's thought of as the inventor of the modern corporation. His picture was in Time magazine. I don't know if anybody knows what magazines are. They used to kill dead trees and print ink on them. My kids will have no idea what they are, but anybody recognize this guy? Alfred P. Sloan. Anybody know who Alfred P. Sloan is? Right? Chairman of General Motors. Right? Chairman of GM, was thought of as kind of the leading innovator. Chairman and president, invented kind of distributed cost accounting. MIT Sloan School is named after him, the Sloan Foundation. In the 20th century, he was one of the most famous executives in the United States. But he wasn't the founder. The founder was this guy. Anyone ever hear of Billy Durant? It's a name you should all remember. Because Billy Durant was the leading horse buggy manufacturer in Flint, Michigan in the beginning of the 20th century. Leading. Owned the business. One day, Billy Durant is sitting drinking with his buddies, also in the horse cart manufacturing business, and they heard this loud set of explosions coming down the street. The first horseless carriage, first automobile ever seen in Flint. And his fellow horse cart manufacturers were hysterical. They thought it was the funniest thing they'd ever seen, and they turned around to laugh with Billy, who was gone. Because the next day, he sold the horse cart business, because he said he saw the future. And for the next 20 years, Billy Durant, because he wasn't a technologist himself, but a great entrepreneur, started buying up technology companies, the most advanced companies at the time, who were making automobiles. And Billy Durant built a company called General Motors. He was the founder. And Billy builds this company until one day his investors get tired of his crazy antics, and they fire him in 1910. And being a great founder, he dusts himself off and builds another company called Chevrolet. He builds Chevrolet into something bigger than General Motors, uses all the stock, buys up GM, and fires the board of directors. Wait a minute, gets better. 10 years later, he starts speculating on Wall Street, almost blows the company. This time, his new board members are the DuPonts, and they fire him again. At the time, in today's dollars, when they fired the founder, GM was in today's dollars $3.6 billion. Durant versus Sloan. Sloan dies rich, honored, and famous. Names on everything. Durant dies managing a bowling alley, penniless, in 1947. He's the accountant. You are here. So thank you very much. This talk is based on the Startup Owner's Manual. Moore Davidow is providing some free books if anybody's interested at the 4 p.m. in the students' room. I'll be there. Thank you very much.